Thank you, thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and above all, professors from all the top 5 or 6 or 7 universities in this country. The thing about greatness, which enwraps Amartya Sen like a robe of some kind, is that it produces other greatness. In other words, good people come to hear him. And that's because they know that this is one of the most remarkable people that you could get to meet. We've known each other for a rather long time, and it's always a thrill to see you. And all I was going to observe was that on certain occasions in Asia House, you hear an expectant buzz, and it's nothing to do with the chairman, chief executive, or Charlie, or any of our other people when they come up here. It's because they know you're going to have a goodie, and the goodie is going to be remarks by Amartya Sen, who, as you know, has transformed all our thinking, not only about India, but about what you might call the good society. I read on the train today this excellent book, and I commend it energetically to all who are here. But it does steer beautifully between what you might call a grad grind, in other words, get into statistics, root out any other approach to life, and at the other end, what Dickens calls the mumbo-jumbo of English and Irish take on society. Now, I can sense myself drifting into something like incoherence, and you want to hear something coherent. So I am going to turn the floor over right away to Professor Amartya Sen, that great and wonderful man, and please listen carefully. There will be a question and an answer at the end, which is what these chairs are for. And when the platform came on, I thought for a moment that we were going to ask Amartya to play the piano, which I'm sure he could do also. Thank you.
Well, delighted to be here, and very grateful for the invitation by Asia House and John in particular. And thank you all for coming and making it promising to be a lively occasion. We have to see whether it is or not. Am I audible? Yeah? I know that I have a microphone here. When I first came to England, one of the questions that bothered me is why people wear ties. And it's only later dawned on me that it's to hold your microphone. Extremely convenient. And for several centuries, the Europeans had no idea why they were wearing ties until the microphone was invented. And then it can be placed, and I'm very well equipped for that today. So thank you for all for coming. India in the Asian perspective is what I'm going to talk about. I could actually, in fact, very easily begin not with India at all, but with Japan in 1860s. Meiji Restoration, 1868. Something happened. Japan comes out of the shell, and it's going to go ahead. And the discussion is, and a dramatic discussion in those years, 1868 to 74, about how could Japan become a major, not a military power, but major economic center of the world, and how could it succeed? And one of the statements that's made is, I think it's Hideyoshi who says that the Japanese and the Americans are no different from each other, excepting they have education and we do not. And that's the clue which begins the Japanese economic development. They decide to go for 100% literacy, which they achieve in 40 years. By about 1905, they're nearly all literate. By 1913, Japan was publishing more books than any other country in the world, and more than twice as many as in the United States. And then similarly, they go through a transition of healthcare, with a power of the state leading education, leading healthcare, at the same time leaving room for private enterprise and the market economy running the industries and agriculture. There was a pattern that developed which was immensely successful economically. And after the Second World War, that model became the standard model in Asia. South Korea was one of the first to go in that direction. The people often comment on the fact that Ghana and South Korea had exactly the same per capita income in 1950, but now South Korea has 20 times that income. The big difference, of course, isn't what some of the people who made that distinction was pointing to, namely Koreans were hardworking. They were hardworking even in 1950. What happened was that they went for a massive expansion of education on the Japanese model and healthcare. And country after country did that. Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore in a dramatic way, Thailand, Indonesia, and then, of course, in a big way, China. The Chinese actually were concerned with education and healthcare anyway, on political grounds. It's one of the Maoist commitments. But they didn't have the private enterprise to make use of it in the way that the Japanese were. And indeed, they were deeply suspicious of the market economy. When that changed, that combination, of course, played an enormous part. Now, the reason I'm mentioning all that is India is the country that didn't do it. It was left out. And that was, I think, possibly the biggest difference that one has to draw on that. Not that nothing happened in India after independence. You have to recognize, no matter how the debate goes, in the period of 200 years of British rule in India, the per capita income hardly rose and might even have fallen. In the last period, namely in the first half of the 20th century until independence, India did grow positively, but you would be not disturbed to hear that the growth rate was 0.1% per year. Compared with that, the so-called low Hindu rate of growth of 3% achieved after independence was a 30% rise. But that, of course, was not sufficient. Now, that growth rate continued to increase because India didn't have basic education, basic healthcare for all, but it's a large country. There were enough pool of educated labor force, enough pool of fairly healthy people. But that is a problem that began to haunt the country as time proceeded. And I think those who try to explain the slowing down of growth rate without bringing in the basic factor of the need for an education and healthy labor force miss out something. They try to seek an explanation in the domain of financial strategy of a much bigger problem, which doesn't quite belong there. That too is important, but there are other things enormously more important. Now, in the period, if you compare India in 1950 with 60 years later, 1911 is the figure, 2011 is the figure I have, things did happen in India. Per capita income in India, 2011, was 5 times as large per capita as it was at the time of independence. The life expectancy went from 32 years to 66 years, more than doubling. Total fertility rate close to 6, that is 6 children per couple, was down to 2.4, which is quite a big thing. The literacy of males going up from 27% to 82%, and females from 9% at the time when the British Empire ended to 65%. These are rises. However, the comparison is not that with what was happening under the empire the comparison is what's happening in Asia at that time. In case of Japan, of course, beginning in the mid-19th century, but then others in the 20th century. If you look at the per capita income, India is 5 times as richer per capita as it was earlier, but Indonesia is 1.5 times richer than India, Thailand 3 times, China 3 times, South Korea 20 times. Now, what about other things? The life expectancy of India in 66 or 65, there are debates on that, let's say 66, compares with 69 in Indonesia, 73 in China, 74 in Thailand, 81 in South Korea. Total fertility rate, replacement is 2.1. India was down to 2.4, but if you look at other states, other countries, Thailand 1.6, well below replacement, China 1.6, South Korea 1.2. And you can go on. Literacy, pretty much universal, male and female for all these other countries. That's where India's major deficiency lies. And if someone says that I'm concerned with inequality, yes, I am. But it's central to that is inequality of what? Income inequality is a big factor, but that's not going to change the nature of an economic performance of a society. In fact, my friend Thomas Piketty's book is a great success, and I'm absolutely delighted that a book called Capital is selling again. There was a book by Marx called that, which fell out of fashion. And I remember in Harvard, there was in the revolutionary days of the 1960s, there was a bookshop called Revolution Bookshop, which started there, and I was catering that. And a left-wing friend of mine came from India, and he went to that bookshop and he asked for, and he went and he said, could I get a copy of second volume of Capita, Das Kapital, or the Capital, second volume, not the Moscow International Publishers publication, but the New York International Publishers Association. And the bookshop said, yes, we don't have it, but we will order it for you. And he took it down and he said, leave your telephone number. And after he left the telephone number, as he was leaving, the Revolution Bookshop wala came up to him and said, you gave the name of the book, but you didn't mention the name of the author. Now there will be a real ambiguity, because it could be Piketty's book we are talking about. And that's all to the good. I think America and Europe needed more discussion of inequality. And yet, without in any way reducing my admiration for what Piketty has done with all the problems that have been raised by Giles and others in Financial Times and so forth, the story still goes through. But the story is really about the very rich, top 1%, top 0.1%, and the rest, and the very poor. But the story of inequality in India is much more vicious than that. If you go by income inequality, actually there's more income inequality in China than there is in India, at least as much. And yet, the idea that everyone has a decent school to go to, has a hospital to go to for attention, has literacy that could survive a PISA test, has opportunities of a kind that the income inequality would not capture. That's what makes China so different from the Indian economy. And if there's something to learn from China, it's certainly not about democracy, but it is something about what we as a democratic country may want to have our democratically elected government to do. And it would be a mistake to think that there's no variation in India on that, and the electoral politics doesn't play a part. In India, 1956, Kerala, or 57, I guess, was already started. They had already a fairly well-developed education system, partly because of the interest of the royal family of Travancore and Cochin, partly because of missionary involvement, and and largely because of the anti-upper caste movement, which focused on education. Now, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Himachal Pradesh went in that direction. And actually, Kerala's life expectancy is considerably higher than that of China, even today. But that's not true of the Indian average at all. And when I was writing about it in the 60s, when I was teaching in Delhi, people would point out to me that, look, they're spending a lot on education and healthcare, but Kerala is one of the poorest states in India. How could they manage? It was one of the 5 poorest in India. Now, if you look at the top 5 per capita income, what are the top 5? That includes Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Himachal Pradesh, exactly the ones. It doesn't include Gujarat, by the way. It includes exactly those which have pursued the policy of what I would see as an Asian policy. So that is, I think, what I would regard as the basic thing that has gone wrong in the case of India. And, there's a new government which has energy, which is a good thing. Ability to deliver, I'm told that could work in any direction. What happened in Gujarat is certainly admirable in terms of physical infrastructure, power, and roads, and they're very important too. But central to that, of course, is education and healthcare, which has so far not figured very much in the manifesto of the ruling party. Being a Democrat, even though they have 31% vote, they did get more than 50% of the seats. They have a legitimate right to govern, and one hopes that they will govern and govern well. And I think one of the important things to recognize about India is that if these things are neglected, this has been possible because of the neglect of these issues, education and healthcare, in public discussion, in political discussion, and that applies even to the left. The left parties are pretty much imploded at the moment. But it can't be claimed that they imploded after arguing for the poorest of the poor in education and healthcare. They imploded on policies which almost seem like similar to that of other political parties. The picture is one in which the complicity of the public and of the media is very large. But the positive side of it is that the importance of the media and the democratic rules of governance apply also to the present government, no matter what their original manifesto is. They are the ruling government democratically elected in a secular democratic country with a secular court, largely secular media, and a secular set of powerful political parties if they could get their act together. And opposition has a major influence on the character of what a country achieves, and not just what the government originally came in. And there are many things to learn from the rest of Asia. I do want time for Q&A, so I won't go on and on now. And I hope there will be interesting questions coming up. But if we look even to our neighbor, to Bangladesh, and they have to declare an interest, in the sense I'm from Dhaka myself, and have an identity with Bangladesh as well. But I have to say, it's not because of the identity. I have to point out that in many ways, not only Bangladesh now has half the income per capita that India has, roughly. The gap has grown because India has been doing so well in terms of income. And in the period for which my friend Manmohan Singh was pilloried, the comparison was always late Manmohan Singh with early Manmohan Singh, because that was the period of dramatic growth. And even if you take the 10 years together, India had a faster rate of growth than any other country. But it was certainly coming down. And the question is, why was it coming down? That's the issue. And why is it that the growth benefited relatively little people? These are the two issues. And here one has to say that Bangladesh, with half its per capita income, but 20 years ago, when Bangladesh was only 50% behind India in per capita income, Bangladesh its life expectancy was 2 years less than India's. Now it's 3 years ahead. Its infant mortality is lower. Its immunization is nearly complete. Its literacy rates, particularly for girls, in fact, much larger. Bangladesh is the only country in the world where the number of girls in school exceeds the number of boys. The employment of women in almost every sphere, from schooling, school teachers, from hospital care, from ancillary activities, from family planning, including the industrial labor force, even though that is a big issue about the lack of safety of the factories. But the Bangladeshi women have played a major part in transforming this country. And there is a lesson there too for India to learn. So I think these are the issues. It's not, I'm concentrating on what India has to learn rather than what India has to teach. A, because Indians like lecturing on what India has to teach much more than what India has to learn. We have things to teach. I think when India became a democratic country, there was no other democratic country of our level of poverty. There was no other democratic country in Africa and Asia and Latin America. We have done things, and we still do things. The courts take tumble every now and then, as I believe they did on the subject of gay sex, and I think there was a real tumble. But the Indian Supreme Court is very peculiar. There's about 36 members, and any two of them may constitute a court. So it really depends on whom there might be, even if one of them is retiring that day, which I gather was the case. So I think we're taking the rough with the smooth. The courts have worked well. The human rights movement have been active. Gender inequality still need much curing, has certainly progressed, and progressed largely because of population, popular involvement. So I think there are things to do there, things to learn there, and basically that if you know what policies you want, to say we can't have it without having Chinese form of non-democracy is absolute rubbish. The Chinese may have to convince 25 people in order to change policy, but they could change the policy in the direction of North Korea or South Korea. It doesn't know, you couldn't be sure which way. And it's happened. And when people say growth rates are higher in democratic countries, it depends on which democratic country. It also includes North Korea, it includes Somalia, it includes Ethiopia, it includes a whole lot of countries which are doing dreadfully badly. I think democracy is something we have reason to admire, to be proud of, to protect, and recognize that in a democratic society, even though it doesn't depend on convincing 25 people at the top, it requires you to convince 800 million people across the country. That's the challenge that democracy faces. But central to that challenge has to be an understanding is what does India need, what has gone wrong, and what can be done by a democratically engaged population to change that. So I'll stop there and then have Q&A. I have to say that I look even more decrepit than I am because of my metal knees. They freeze if I stand. And then I mustn't start climbing because I may have a precipitate decline until the blood starts flowing. Yeah. Maybe I'll hold your hand. Yeah. It will come back. The blood, that is.
Well, thank you. Am I on? Hello. Thank you so much, Professor Sen. That was fantastic. My name is Charlie Humphreys. I'm the Director of Corporate Affairs here, and I'm going to moderate the Q&A session. I wonder if I might just start with a very quick question of my own. You, just on the comments towards the end of your remarks there, you pointed out some fundamental differences between China and India. But one of the things, obviously, which China did throughout the latter part of the 20th century, a process which is arguably ongoing, is hundreds of millions of people moving from agricultural production into industrial production, and therefore raising the GDP growth. Can India do that in the next?
It's happened in India. If you look at the urbanization, the number of people who have moved from the rural area to urban area in India is almost comparable to that in China. That's not a problem. What you're pointing out is that in the rural area, in the urban areas, they often get jobs of a kind that Indians don't, because the Indian movement has been mainly in the tertiary sector, services of various kinds, from a whole range of things, from domestic servants to other kind of, hotel, this, that, another. I think because of having a bigger base of good education, it is possible for the Chinese to manufacture almost any commodity in the world. Indians can manufacture certain things well, IT, pharmaceuticals, auto parts. You're done, more or less. The Chinese can manufacture almost anything because you look at the instructions, you can produce according to specification, and that is a dramatic advantage. If I look at my table, whether it's my calculator or the computer or this mobile phone or stapler, are all made in China. So that is a level of flexibility that education allows. It's already part of the conversation in 1860s in Japan. Makes a big difference, that. I think that's the story you have to concentrate on, not so much people are not moving to the urban areas. India is much more urban today than it's ever been, and some people explain even the electoral change, unpredictability of it is connected with that. So that's really, I'm glad you asked the question because it fits into what I wanted to say.
I was listening, just in case you're wondering.
Yeah, you're being very kind. Yeah.
I think we're going to, now, there's microphones. If you can raise your hand, wait for the microphone, and we'll start with Ravi down here. Please say who you are and a little bit about where you're from, and just keep your interjections quite brief if we can, so get around as many as possible. Thank you.
Sure. Ravi Bulchandani from JP Morgan. Two very brief questions, if I may. One way of interpreting what you've said is that slow growth in India is partly an artifact of not having spent enough on education and health. But you could quite easily reverse that and say the reason that health outcomes and educational outcomes haven't been so good is because growth hasn't been so strong. There is an important resource constraint in devoting resources to health and education. And then the second question is, I haven't detected a significant lack of political will to improve educational and health outcomes in India, but the output, the results have been very poor. Isn't there a significant execution issue as well? Empty schools and poorly run hospitals. Isn't there a significant component of execution that has failed in India as well?
Yeah. Well, I think both are very interesting questions. But let's take the first. Do we need money first to be able to make education and healthcare go ahead? That's not Kerala did it. That's not how Tamil Nadu did it. That's not how China did it. They were quite poor when they did it. China became completely illiterate in the Maoist period, when they had almost no money and they were totally dysfunctioning economy. Didn't improve the economy because they are deeply suspicious of the market economy. So I think that is not the sequence. And when Japan did it, by the way, it was desperately for Japan that did it. So I think to say that let's go rich, then we'll do all this, really puts the cart before the horse. I'm not accusing you of doing it, but you are showing some sympathy for an argument which could be extended in that direction, and I don't want you to have sympathy for that argument. And secondly, you're talking about execution, and that's certainly true. It's not the case that there are schools, empty schools, and no one there. Very rarely, actually. There is an attendance issue. They're related to the nature of the school. We did some research. I was very lucky when I got the Nobel. I used that money to start two trusts, one in India, one in Bangladesh. And the Bangladesh one is concerned with gender, which is really the big, as I discussed, Bangladesh scene. as far as the Indian schools are concerned, one of the things, I mean, we did start a few schools, but that wasn't the big thing. The big thing was to be able to see what's going wrong with the school. Quite often if you ask, you ask someone, peasant, why is it that your daughter is not in the school? You hardly ever get an answer, women don't need education. Almost never. The only thing is that, she's a small girl, there's one teacher, there's no toilet. And what happens if I go to the field and, to work, and my wife goes with me, where the school teacher hasn't come up? So I think these are connected with, you may say execution, connected with the planning of the school, been desperately planned. And I think it seems difficult to think that these are impossible to run, because there are states in India which have done it. Himachal Pradesh is particularly interesting because it went there very late and dramatically improved, as it happened originally under a BJP government. And it made a major difference over a much shorter span of years. And now the school education accomplishment in Himachal Pradesh is almost comparable to that in Kerala, despite their century-old history. So I think you have to really, rather than treating it as a reason for saying, therefore it didn't work, we might as well go for private education. There's no country in the world which has become fully educated or had universal health care with private schooling and private health care. No country at all. If you look for not only countries radical like China, but say Thailand, very troubled country now from a democratic electoral point of view, and yet they have 100% literacy, 100% universal health coverage. Their life expectancy is larger than China, 74 years. And pretty much anyone can get that cover. How come? It's organization. And, I'm happy to say that in Nalanda University, which is our great pride, the oldest, some people may not know it, here is the oldest university in the world. It was started 420 AD. When Bologna was born, it was 600 years old already. It was destroyed in 1197 in an Afghan attack. And and the library burned for 3 days, a 9-story library. But we're trying to revive it. It had 10,000 students at its peak, drawn not only from India, but also from China, Japan, Korea, Thailand, the entire there was a Buddhist university, entire Buddhist ecumen. And that we're reviving, and one of the schools we want to do, we are beginning with history and environmental and ecological studies, but one of the next ones we are considering would be School of Public Health. Since I'm Chancellor of the university, we're trying to do these education actually play a part in dealing with what you are calling the execution gap.
Okay, we've got someone, a gentleman here at the back here.
Thank you. Dr. Krishnan is the Sri Lankan High Commissioner to the UK. I very much enjoyed your speech, Professor. There's a general feeling that the new Modi government heralds a very positive and probably a paradigm change in India's economic ascendance. And I just wonder whether you could share your thoughts regarding that. Thank you.
Well, I hope you're right. But so far, not much has happened. And, we have to, you're pointing out expectations and hope. I have also hope and expectations. But we can't judge anything because nothing has happened, in fact, so far. Does it have a good record? It has a good record of administration in some fields, attracting industries, in keeping power run through the night, and having roads. But the problem really is that in India, when there's a power failure, everyone grumbles about it. As all the newspapers said in July 2 years ago, 600 million people plunged into darkness. What they didn't mention is that 200 million of those 600 million had no electric connection ever. So that they were not plunged into darkness, they were certainly in darkness, but like in the last days of Pompeii, they probably did better, as the blind man did, you might remember, because he was able to move around when others couldn't see. So I think it has to be, you have to pay attention to not only power, but also power for everyone. You have to pay attention to education for everyone and healthcare for everyone. That's where the issues lie. And if there are things to learn from the Asian experience of Japan and China and Korea and so on, it's certainly that. These were not particularly left-wing governments. By no stretch of imagination we will describe the Meiji rule to be a paradigm of socialism. But they had this thing, that certain thing that we shared, in the same way as Europe and America did earlier, basic education. When we carried out in India, and that's one of the more positive things happened, school meals for everyone, taking care of nutritional problem as well as education. What we were learning from? We're learning from Europe, not introduced by any particularly left-wing government, that too, but many others. I think Bismarck had a lot to say on that. So actually you have to see who people identify with. I mean, I would be classified, I guess, being on the left, which I am. On the other hand, I don't think it's only a left-right issue. It is recognizing that what is needed in order to treat every human being as being in some ways deserving of equal respect. And that could well put you you're not likely to become a fascist or a Nazi on that, but you could be a conservative right wing and still have that commitment, as I believe Bismarck certainly would be classified as having.
We have this lady here in the pink.
Thank you. Valentine Moradam, Northeastern University, Boston. Some years back, Professor Sen, you placed rather a high premium on democracy when you were discussing famine in China versus India. If I did not misunderstand your comments tonight, you seem to be raising some fundamental questions about India's ability to deliver the benefits of development to all its citizens. So my question is democracy irrelevant to development?
I hope that's not what you thought. I said, I think famine, but I'm delighted, as always, we used to know each other when we used to visit Finland. But the importance of famine is this. Certainly democracy prevents famines from occurring. Why is that the case? Well, because government, famines are dead easy to prevent. That was the subject of my first book on famines, 1981, poverty and famines. But why aren't they prevented? Well, the government doesn't have an incentive. With democracy, they do. Do they? Why? The proportion of the population threatened by famine is tiny, never more than 10%, rarely more than 5%. How come they have such an electoral clout? It's public reasoning, public discussion, that a decent country, and unlike, say, British India and independent India, cannot have famine. That becomes a commitment of everyone, not only those who are threatened. We have not been able to succeed in saying a country like India should not have illiteracy or such bad education and such chaotic healthcare. That hasn't happened. But what the famine indicates, you don't have to say it has to be in the interest of the active population, actively vocal people, to do that. It has to be part of the consent. We as human beings are both, to take a European medieval distinction, we are both patients and agents. You have to see ourselves as being agents in the context of democracy. And our agency is threatened if we live in a country which has periodic famine, so we haven't had one since 47, but since 43, which is what happened in last famine in India. But massive undernourishment, massive illiteracy, these are not famine. They don't have the dramatic characteristic. Undernourishment, no one is dying in front of you, excepting their mortality rate is being elevated. Their life expectancy is being pulled down. Requires much more imagination, much better public reasoning. And that is where we had failed. So the quality of democratic dialogue is exactly what is needed. It's not so much democracy has become irrelevant, it's become so relevant that we have to understand that we can achieve it only by making it a democratic issue. And that is ultimately a praise of democracy. You see, I think the model that an authoritarian country has is never a good model because you don't, as I mentioned, we don't know whether China could have gone towards North Korea. And once they looked, it might be, but didn't. And learn much more from South Korea, though they don't like admitting it, but indeed that's the case. And similarly, you can think of many others. South Korea itself. It was originally many of the things carried out by governments who were not particularly keen on democracy. But the forces of democracy were very strong in South Korea right from the beginning, from the students' movement. In everywhere you saw pictures of students being clubbed down and so on. So I think the democratic commitment is really a major commitment. So I'm afraid I'm using your argument as a peg on which to hang a lot of clothings of democracy. But that's my intention.
So someone in the middle here on this side. Yep, gentleman pointing to his own head.
Hey, my name is Milan Ketzman. I work for Al Centra, but I have a friend who's a professor of economics at Oxford. So, my question is about corruption and what role it plays in holding countries back. Maybe in India they have more corruption than in countries which have moved ahead, or maybe not.
Let me say three things. Yes, day before yes, no. 3 days before yesterday, I was sitting in Trinity High Table with a guest who was dining there, guest of somebody else. And she was telling me that they conducted a survey as to what is mainly wrong with the world in different countries. In India, in Australia, in Hong Kong, and one other country, I think Seoul. And the answer invariably was corruption. So I think the claim that corruption is unique in India isn't really the right story, number one. Number two, it's not even the case that the corruption has increased. Corruption has always been very large in India. What has happened, and this actually didn't help the Congress government, one of their flagships, of course, was the right to information. India had a more extensive right to education than any other country in the world. In fact, sometimes invading privacy of people. When you reveal the government has some record about two persons who had a relationship with each other, there's some serious, interesting legal things. But I think what nailed the Congress government was that corruption was much easier to bring into public notice once the Right to Information Act came in. And between 1 million to 2 million cases are brought under right to information every year. So I think that's not just a negative story, it's a positive story, because that's what made corruption a big issue in India. And you would not eliminate corruption until it becomes a big issue for, as I said in response to Val, that in a democratic country you have to make it a democratic issue. It has become one. So I think that's what you have to look at. Now, it so happens that the corruption form that India had was particularly counterproductive to many of the lives of very common people. Korea had huge amount of corruption at the time of its industrial breakthrough. The chobels and the old houses which had connection, business connection with the government, high level of corruption at a very high price. On the other hand, that you can't get a milk coupon or you can't get a normal entitlement to a hospital care without passing some money, is really totally counterproductive to the lives of people. Now that's where the corruption has become an issue. I'm sad, even though I thought that Aam Aadmi Party, which is the anti-corruption party, their policies were completely confused. On the other hand, there is no question that they were showing a very important way forward, namely that want a non-corrupt government that could be a major electoral issue itself. They ultimately didn't get that many seats, and they all got it for one state. But it has to be, the future of India has to accept, A, the fact that while corruption may be universal, and it may not be the case that India has more of it, but we have more knowledge of it now, and it is also a more, it has a creepiness in the sense that it's so extensive at very low level and not only at very high level, which makes it difficult. I'm not pardoning high-level corruption, I'm not arguing for it. I'm just saying that its immediate impact on the life of day-to-day people is much larger. So bear this in mind. Am I an optimist? Yes, I am an optimist, because I think we know a lot about how to improve, how to reduce corruption. The earlier situation of license Raj, with which actually originally Manmohan Singh appeared in the Indian political scene, namely to abolish the license Raj, for which everything you needed a license, a permit from the government. And that's, of course, ideal for creating corruption at that level. And it still works a fair amount even today. And those are ways that we can think about it. So we know intellectually more. We can get more information by making even greater use of the right to information, and we can politicize it. And the fact that a party with a somewhat confused program, but breathing fire about corruption didn't win, doesn't mean that you cannot win election breathing fire and corruption just in the way as Aam Aadmi did, but more better thought out policies about the economy as a whole.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions. Let's have the gentleman waving his arm, I believe is the Bangladesh High Commissioner.
I couldn't resist for two reasons, because the professor is compatriot from his other homeland, and I was a student. Professor, good to see you. It reminds me of our classes with Bob Nozick yourself. But my question is, I see a very interesting ring of Tagore in your accent on education. Of Rabindranath Tagore in your accent on education. And he saw in education the ultimate freedom.
Yeah.
But also, the legacy of Tagore lies in the initiatives he took in Sriniketan. And how much do you see Bangladesh, India drawing from that legacy? How much do you see promise of drawing from that legacy as we look forward?
I think the Bangladesh's experience is connected with three different things, in my judgment. One is, of course, the literature background. That includes not only Tagore, but it includes Qazi Nazrul Islam, because he was very committed to education for all. And also it goes back into Bengali literature of an earlier period. Pullara Varamasa. This was probably the first long epic poem about the life of a poor woman called Pullara, how her life goes. And so I think there was a tradition, and as I understand it, when Bangladesh split from Pakistan, there was a tendency to particularly emphasize those things that Bengalis had in common, which included an issue about gender, issue about education, and so that played a certainly big part. Secondly, I think the movement itself, the political movement of not just the Mukti Bahini, but also the agitation, brought in a much greater radicalization of questioning the past. And that included, and why should we tolerate? Now, if you look at small things, why is it Bangladesh has 100%, nearly 100% immunization, 97%, and India is only about 58%? Why? Why is it that 50% of the Indians don't have any toilet at home, which was the situation in Bangladesh, but became a big issue, and now only about 8% doesn't have it. I think these are connected with exactly what we're discussing, the political process of the democratic thing. So the literature background played a part, the pride of the literature and the tradition, and Qazi Nazrul Islam is very important in that because he was a revolutionary. In a way, Tagore always shied away from revolution, is very important. And I think the dynamics of that combined with NGOs in Bangladesh, which is really popular participation from beginning with BRAC and Grameen Bank and Bonafrasto and so on. And there was a kind of participatory understanding of Bangladeshi politics, which also, I'd say these three are probably the most important thing, in which, yes, Tagore is very important too, but not uniquely.
I'm just wondering if there's anyone over there. Yeah, there's a gentleman just on the front right there.
Maybe I'll just come forward and ask questions. Yeah, I'm sitting in the other room. Yeah, my name is Sujan Das, and I'm a scientist, not an economist. So I come with interest, but very little knowledge of economics. But in one of your essays, I had read about the overproduction of grain and rice in India.
Overproduction of?
Of grain and rice in particular in India, and the subsidies that the government gives to farmers. So in the context that India overproduces grain and rice such that you need ships to dump it in the ocean, but yet the government buys grain from the farmers. Do you think the government should continue to give subsidy to the farmers, and if so, to what extent? And should there be a shift from the agrarian economy that we have had to invest more in
I think three things to say again. I'm sorry, I'm always dividing them into 3 points. One is that what I said, that was something written 15 years ago. I was mainly concerned with the fact that we had a lot of grain, India had, in storage. In fact, enough, if you put the wheat sacks and the rice sacks, mostly wheat, next to each other, we could, 15 years ago, go to the moon and come back. So we had a huge amount, and we were still not doing anything on the food security. Now, there has been a food security bill recently. It's flawed, but at least an attempt to go in that direction. I wasn't arguing against overproduction. I was arguing for not making good use of the output that is generated by the incentive provided by food prices. Now, the second point is, what should be the food price issue today? I just don't know. That is a technical issue. You have to look at exactly what the situation is. The monsoon last year was good. Monsoon this year may not be good. It appears there's some signs that it's bad. And if that happens, then you will need those stocks. So I think there is no substitute to thinking intelligently with all the information that you have, not just in the context of corruption we discussed, what the information the public has, but also the information that the state has. One of the problems in the Chinese famine of at the time of the Great Leap Forward, in which 30 million people died, the largest famine ever recorded. Those who say that until we give up democracy and go in China's way, we are not going to win. have to reflect on it. 30 million people died. For 3 years, the terrible policy wasn't changed. Not a single newspaper commented on that. Not an editorial commented on that. And every commune, since they were reading that there was enormous success of grain production elsewhere, they didn't want to lose their heads, so they pretend that they also had a success. So when Beijing added these up, Beijing thought that they had 110 million tons more food than they actually had. So that censorship ultimately defeated the government too. But the government has to make detailed knowledge, have detailed knowledge of these, and then decide on that. So I'm not going to make an announcement as to what policy we'll make today, taking into account everything, including the monsoon, this, that, and other. And the third issue is, I still welcome your question, because it is about feeding, because India may have, there's a total confusion. People think India don't have any famine, that's true. And even when China was having a famine, we didn't. Chinese last famine may have filled into in the 60s. Our last famine was in the 40s in the British period. But the extent of undernourishment is so massive and so little understood as to how massive that is, including some people writing that Indians are very short and therefore you mustn't measure undernourishment by looking at their shortness and so on. But Indians will go about like you, seem tall enough to me. Actually, we want to stand up. Okay, that will do. Yeah. So I think I would say that I think the food issue requires attention, just as the education and health issue, on which I've been mostly concentrating in this lecture. Okay. So thank you.
Time for one more, but we're going to have to do it quite briefly. If we can have this lady here in the glasses, if you can, as a question and answer brief, then we have time.
Marisha Ray, I'd like to ask about the million missing women. Are you happy with the response, and what do you feel should be done about it? And what do you feel is a reasonable timescale to address the issue?
About what? About
the million missing women. Are you happy with the response, political and other, to it? Are you, what do you feel is a reasonable timescale to have addressed the problem of the million missing women and its continuance? It's now an accepted fact, thanks to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Marisha. Yes, there was there's 100 million missing women was a paper in New York Review, was published in 1990, some time ago. At the same time, I also published a paper in the British Medical Journal, which pretty much nobody reads, though it did the math of it exactly right, and New York Review, it also was on the cover. More than 100 million women are missing, is what was the cover. But I think one thing that's happened since 1990 was based on 1980s statistics. You see, the main reason why women were missing were their differential care of girls compared with boys. That still exists in India in some parts, but dramatically come down, and in some parts doesn't exist at all. Like your own state, like West Bengal, women survive better than girls survive better than boys do. On the other hand, for India as a whole, yes. But why is it that the number of missing women has not declined in India? It's mainly because they've been replaced by a different kind of anti-female prejudicial action, namely sex-specific abortion, which didn't exist in the 1980s. And therefore my 1990 article, whether in the New York Review or the British Medical Journal, didn't have that. Since then it's become massive. It's odd, actually. If you look at India, it splits into, and I have a follow-up paper in the New York Review. It's called Indian Women, The Mixed Truth. Came out in October last year. And you can look it up, Marisha. And you'll see there's a map. And there is about half the states in India, in south and east, the ratio of boys to girls at birth is within the European range. And for all states in north and the West, it's way below the European way. There's a gap. And it splits peculiarly, so much so the editor, Robert Silvers, went on asking, are you sure that these statistics are right? These are census and NSS and all these things. And so am I happy with something? Yes, I'm happy that some parts of the country that's the case, unlike in China where it's almost every province has that. Secondly, are we doing enough? Now, South Korea had that problem, but they converted into a big issue about the treatment of female fetuses, and they changed the picture. That is another democratic dialogue in which we could be involved. Are we happy about other issues about women, like the rape situation? Indian rape rates are not higher than that of other countries. The official rates are, of course, very low. This country and the United States has about 30 times as much rape per unit of population, officially reported, than as India. Now, the Indians are underreported, but how much? Even if you raise it 10 times, it would still be that Britain has 3 times as much rape than India has. The real problem isn't that. The real problem is getting attention from the police if you are raped. That helps a lot if you come from a privileged quarter. Same thing that biases our education and healthcare also biases this. Ultimately, the great success, and we are all both ashamed about what happened, but all also proud of the fact that she wanted to fight, was there on the 16th of December, 2012. There was, after all, a medical student. Now, it's the fact that the rapes that happen in the rural areas, especially to poor, Dalit, lowest caste women, very hard. And there's another way of judging it. Rape and sexual harassment can happen in families of people sitting here. Sexual trafficking does not. That affects only the poorest. And that's not a big issue in the Indian newspaper, even though the number of sexual trafficked young girls is very large. The media issue is very important here, because you and I know some people who have been sexually harassed, may even have been raped. On the other hand, we don't know within our circle anyone who has been sexually trafficked. That happens to very, very poor people. So you have to combine the class and the gender and the biases of the media. Short answer to your question, Marisha, is that I'm happy with some bits of the progress, which also gives me hope and encouragement that more can happen. But I'm unhappy with many of the things in which democratic engagement, media involvement, and the involvement of all of us, just in the case of the abolition of famines, which Val brought up earlier, is important. So I think that's the way to look at it. We have to play it according to our analysis as to what has really gone wrong. And thinking about it, asking the question you're asking, is itself a contribution to it.
Well, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, unfortunately we are now out of time. We're over time, but I'm sure you'll agree with me that we have had a treat this evening. So I'll ask you to thank Amartya Sen for being with us, and I hope you'll stay around and join us for networking and drinks and refreshments. Thank you.